stream. Make sure that it's running. Cool. And of course, that didn't do anything. All right. So, before we start, yes, thank you YouTube for letting me know, or Gmail for letting me know my YouTube video's up. Just as a reminder, your first paper is due a week from today, so again, don't be emailing me next week, like 11 o'clock at night on Tuesday, asking me what the paper's about. It's usually a little bit late. Again, those of you here looking at me, if you could print it out and bring it in, that'd be great. If not, and again, this is for you online folks, don't bother trying to bring it in, although I have had some online people that like live in Lake City and brought it in, so that's cool too. But if you can't print it out, / if you're online, you can email it to me, and that's fine, just to my fmarion email. But attach it as a document, like the linking to the Google Docs doesn't always work. So, and in fact, I've noticed now that the whatever firewall they use for the FMU email apparently is now catching those links and not always sending them to me. So yeah, attach a Word document or a PDF document to the email and send it to me that way. Yeah, so again, that's next Wednesday. Any questions about anything before we get into stuff? Great. Next order of business. This is chapter 19. So once we finish this chapter, we will be having the second test. So these things are, as usual, coinciding, which means for me a lot of grading all at once. There is no way we're finishing the chapter today. We're just really getting this chapter started. There is a very slight chance we'll finish this next Monday, but the more likely is we'll get near the end on Monday, finish it out on Wednesday and do the review, and then have the test the following week. So that's how we'll do it. But I'll probably still put the study guide up on Blackboard over the weekend just so you guys can look at it. But it depends on how far we get through today. But more than likely there'll be too much to go over on Monday to also be able to do the study guide on that day. But we'll see. All right, so we did muckrakers last time, the various journalists and whatnot, and Teddy Roosevelt, which we'll get into Roosevelt in more detail later on. I'll actually talk about the jungle in greater detail later on as well. All right, let me actually get my book open to where this is. Right. So as we saw in the previous chapter, women progressives played a large role in this movement, in particular improving the state of the impoverished. We talked about the settlement houses being like a major part of this, well, Jane Addams called it civic housekeeping. Jane Addams established the first settlement house in America called the Hull House. She was visiting Britain with a friend of hers, and they visited a settlement house there in Britain, and they were like, hey, this seems like a really good idea. Why don't we do this in America? So she did. Simple as that. So a lot of the women that worked at and established these settlement houses, because, I mean, obviously it wasn't just Hull House, were college educated. Let me make sure that, hold on, I want to make sure the sound is working. Okay. College educated women who were shut out of male dominated jobs because, again, this is like late 1800s, early 1900s. Adams, again, called this civic housekeeping, where they could protect their households from the chaos of urbanization and industrialization by attacking the sources of the chaos at the root, which, again, we saw at the very end of the last chapter, where the idea was that the political machines and the city bosses were soothing the symptoms of the problem. You know, the people were going hungry, and they'd give them, you know, food on holidays. If people were made homeless by the tenements burning down, they would occasionally, you know, set up temporary shelters for them. But with Jane Addams and her ideas, it was, we shouldn't be temporarily fixing their problems. We should be fixing what's causing the problems. For her, it was largely like education and making it so that they could get better jobs and not have to live in squalor and barely able to get by. That was what she was about. There are also various women's clubs. We had they were all brought together under the General Federation of Women's Clubs. I believe men were distracted by politics and business, so they needed to take on the burden of civic duties, which, of course, since it was taken on by women, they also pushed for women's welfare, shorter hours, benefits for widows, child labor laws, increased health care for mothers. You know, the sort of thing that would be nice for women, since they were also in the working field and were getting far less benefits, despite being, it's like, working just as hard as the men. It's like, oh yeah, we'll pay you less and not give you any benefits when your husband's killed in a factory, despite, you know, paying him more. And oh, you're out because you birthed an entire human being. Well, sucks for you. Guess you're fired now. You know, that sort of thing. As is often shorthand, the Industrial Revolution and its consequences. So this is an image of the Hull House at its peak, in this old brick building. Today, only this much of it remains. But to be fair, because it's in the middle of freaking Chicago, there was a move by the city to attempt to tear it down. But the neighborhood rallied around it and wanted it to be protected as a historic landmark. So it's now protected as a historic landmark, so they can't touch it. If I remember right, a student wrote a paper on this, which is why I know that. I didn't actually do the research myself. A student wrote a paper, and that's how I found out about it. Now, there's that image again of Jane Addams reading to the children. And again, a lot of this was basic education, but it was more than they could get where they were. This was also neat. It was, teaching, like, not sewing, but this is basic textile work, like old style textile work. You've got essentially home ec class here, learning to cook. Because, if your parents are off working like 16-hour shifts, you're not going to have time to do anything else. Now, obviously, something else that folks like Jane Addams pushed for was women's suffrage. So until 1910, women only had the right to vote in a couple of states in the West. As we had mentioned in previous chapters, many suffragettes saw the passing the 14th and 15th Amendment says something negative because it gave more voting rights to men, in particular black men, but it left women out entirely. Because remember, there was that push where it's like, well, if we expand the right to vote, then eventually it'll come to women, and it didn't. Not until a further push by women. The National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, as we saw again several chapters back, went about doing things their own way, and then they combined their efforts to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, because why not just throw all the words together? By 1908, they could vote in 15 states in the territory of Alaska. But again, if they could only vote in states, not at a federal level, they could only vote for local and state elections. They couldn't vote for, like, federal representatives, senators, the president, that kind of thing. So they could only vote for local and state issues. Still, though, despite the joining of these various associations, the push for women's suffrage was still a broad coalition, with the various groups having different arguments on why women should vote. So we had women like Jane Addams, who saw the vote as a natural continuation of civic housekeeping, which is to say, helping men with, making society more orderly. Whereas women like Alice Paul wanted the vote on the basis of equality with men, rather than some level of subservience. She founded the National Woman's Party, sought Congress to adopt an Equal Rights Amendment to give women full legal equality. And that was very much ahead of her time, unfortunately. I mean, shoot, it wasn't until, 1970-something that women could get, like, a bank account under their own name? I mean, and even today, there's certain inequality. But we're going to leave that alone for the moment. Still, though, America, the, bastion of freedom and whatnot, we were way behind other countries. New Zealand was the first, 1893, Australia in 1902, and Norway in 1913, passing women's suffrage amendments, or don't think they were necessarily amendments, but laws that allow for women to vote. The United States finally passed the 19th Amendment in 1919, which allowed for women in the United States to vote. I think Britain was also ahead of us, but New Zealand, Australia, and Norway were just like the first three. As far as like Western nations. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Britain was at least a year ahead of us. So here we have some images. Women's suffrage headquarters in of Ohio. Give the women a square deal. This is a response to the politics of the day. I think it was Wilson. Vote for amendment number 23, September 3rd. No, that's the local amendment, not the federal amendment. Come in and learn why women ought to vote. President Wilson says it's time to support women's suffrage. Yeah, Wilson. Headquarters, National Association opposed to women's suffrage. And there you have a woman walking by here. It's good for them that this wasn't during the Victorian era where women had those big hat pins. Have you ever seen those? They're about yay long, and they're basically just these giant needles. Demand an amendment to the United States Constitution enfranchising women. This one's later, obviously, 1944. We'll look more at that later as well. Self-respecting woman should wish or work for a society for the success of a party that ignores her sex, said Susan B. Anthony. And here's an interesting image, because typically when we look at the movement of, usually it's technology, but even like societal and social norms, it's from the East Coast west. The cities are all over here. Most of the cultural norms happen over on the East Coast, and then it moves westward. Especially in the 1800s, early 1900s, the West was still pretty unruly. But when it came to the right for women to vote, the West was ahead of the times. And maybe even got like a little poem down here at the bottom, in case you want to check that out on, you see it online. All right. So women weren't the only ones trying to achieve some level of equality. Things were actually getting worse for black citizens, voter disenfranchisement, lynching, and race riots to keep them away from the polls. Because again, technically on paper they could vote, but if they don't go to the polls because reasons, well, that's on them. So the various leaders of black communities of the day approached the situation in different ways. So we had Booker T. Washington, which I imagine everyone's heard of, founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, wanted blacks to accept segregation, work on moral and economic development, and stay out of politics. Though he did task whites with making good on their promise of protecting blacks from race-related violence, which they didn't do a very good job of. Now, that said, the book does mention here, let's see, we are a nation within a nation. We must see see to it that in every wise and legitimate way our people are taught to patronize racial enterprises. Yet Washington was a complex figure who secretly financed and supported court challenges to electoral disenfranchisement, railroad segregation, jury discrimination, and peonage, which is to say forced labor to repay debt. You know, the slavery without saying slavery thing. Whoop. Now, needless to say, not everybody was on board with Washington, despite his pretty substantial pull in the community. We had Ida B. Wells, who we already talked about at the beginning of the chapter. In fact, she was in that muckraker section. She wrote for the Free Speech newspaper, investigated lynchings and racial inequality, and of course spoke out about lynchings and racial inequality. And by doing so, her newspaper's building was burned down, but instead of being intimidated out of speaking out against the violence that nearly took her own life, she went up to Chicago and continued speaking out against lynching and race violence, because that's just how she was. And I've got an image of her in just a moment, and she was something else. Also, some of her quotes are real intense. She was great. And finally, we have W.B. Du Bois, who we are also spoken of a bit, that I also said was very important. He wanted immediate suffrage, immediate equal rights, none of this laws that discriminate based on heritage and family finance and blah blah, all of which was specifically made to disenfranchise black voters. He founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. And in 1915, they won a case in the Supreme Court which struck down the grandfather clause, which specifically discriminated against black voters. The grandfather clause, if I remember right, being the one where you had to take a literacy test. But, oh yeah, by the way, if your grandfather could read, then, or if your grandfather could vote, then the literacy test doesn't count, and you can go ahead and vote. But if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you have to take the literacy test. And obviously, at this time, if you were a black American, your grandfather probably was enslaved, so he would not have been able to vote. Therefore, you have to take the literacy test. But if you were a white American and you couldn't read, your grandfather probably could vote anyway, so it didn't apply to you. The grandfather clause was just specifically racist. There was no other reason behind the grandfather clause but to be racist. So here we have some real good quotes from these folks. Two ways of exerting one's strength. One is pushing down, the other is pulling up. So, use your strength to help others as opposed to making things worse. Associate yourself with good people, or people of good quality, for it is better to be alone than in bad company. Here's Ida B. Wells. The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. Hey, put light on the cockroaches and they'll scatter. Although another quote from her, because, again, what she was doing was very dangerous. One had better die fighting against injustice than to die like a dog or a rat in a trap. Because what she was doing was putting her life in danger. And here we have Du Bois again. A system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect. And that is a hell of a quote, because the American system of government, the voting system, the judicial system, it wasn't failing African Americans because it was never meant to protect them. It was meant to keep them subjugated and keep white Americans on top. That was what it was, how it was built from the start. And it just needed to be reorganized so that all people will be protected equally. But that would take a bit of organization, and considering how many people in power were still very anti anybody that wasn't white, it was going to take a lot of work. And he says here again, the power of the ballot we need in sheer defense, else what shall save us from a second slavery? And again, that was what was said by even the Northerners in, the late 1800s, even the ones that were like racist, or like, oh, they can't govern themselves. But if they don't have the right to vote, they're just going to be re-enslaved, and we can't let that happen, because then the Civil War would have had no point. Also, what I find interesting here is that one of the biggest voices in, well, not necessarily emancipation, he was born after the Civil War, but in, black suffrage, in civil rights, the dude lived almost 100 years. Usually people fighting this fight when, racial violence was really high and really common and really supported / perpetrated by the government, a lot of these people didn't live very long. So the fact that this dude lived almost 100 years is real impressive. All right, let's go somewhere a little less depressing, because it'd be a while before all of this fixes itself. So there was this push for morality, and it went from social reform to social control, where the morals of the progressives went so far that they felt like they should impose their social norms on the populace, and it got a little heavy-handed. And again, you are kind of seeing that a little bit today now sometimes. Prohibition. This is all just prohibition. There was pushes for prohibition attempts before the Civil War, but it never really caught on. 1869, the Prohibition Party was created. 1881, Kansas's Constitution prohibited the consumption of alcohol. Now, I've been through Kansas. I've not spent a lot of time in Kansas, but we drove through Kansas. Kansas is flat, and it has fields of grain. I don't know how people exist there without being constantly drunk. So, that sounds like hell. I guess they have tornadoes, so that's exciting. As I mentioned before, women were often a major force behind Prohibition. They formed the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. Again, temperance meaning essentially sobriety. This idea of just not drinking. Frances Willard led the group, using the platform for women's suffrage, child labor laws, labor unions, etc. However, after she died, the union just went back to temperance issues. Then we also had the Anti-Saloon League in 1893. They had a big appeal in the South. They also had the coolest name because they had saloon in the name. 21 states banned liquor sales between 1906 and 1917, mostly in the South and West. So, of course, we're the boring ones. Which is weird because, like, today you can go to, like, a grocery store and get alcohol. But up north, when I lived in, like, Rhode Island, you couldn't get alcohol in, like, you can't get alcohol in a grocery store. You have to go to an alcohol store. Like, the ABC store, the little red dot store. You have to go to a separate store to get alcohol. You can't just, like, go to the back of a food line or whatever and get beer. I don't know. We had the 18th Amendment, which was also passed in 1919, that made prohibition the law of the land. And as I said to my other class, organized crime rejoiced because they had a new thing that they could sell to people and make money, and they made so much money. This is when organized crime really took off. Not that they weren't already making money. I mean, like I said, they would just do little stuff like, bless you, work site things and, funneling money and other, just like real white collar stuff. But when it came to speakeasies and rum running, and that was where you made the money. And so many cops, like, also wanted the beer that they would usually let you go if you gave them a little bit. So this is the, like, ideal prohibition party. It's, controlled by the church, and it's this big utopia. I don't know why I'm pointing with my hand. I keep forgetting we're online. I don't know why we've got tents over here. I guess they'd rather live in tents than in houses, because down here it's like, this is the reality. It's dingy houses and smokestacks and all that. Like, yeah, but I think I'd rather live in a house than a tent. Tents aren't very cozy. Oh, I keep forgetting I've got this. Monroe County Crusader, Prohibitionist Cary County. So the Prohibition Party had its own little animal mascot, and it was, of course, a camel, because camels are, known for not having to drink very much. Now, the reality is that camels drink a lot, and then they store it in the fat on their humps. Camels also really like beer, because beer, if you're aware, is made of hops, which is a type of grain, and an animal like a camel, and also horses, by the way, like grain. Camels especially, because they've got really good grippy mouths. They can just grab a bottle and drink the whole thing. I have seen it. I've seen a horse do it in person too. So yeah, camel's probably not the best choice they could have had, but they weren't quite aware of that yet. But yeah, camels enjoy beer. Very amusing. Here's the image that I wanted to show you guys since basically the start of the semester. The Drunkard's Progress. So we start over here. A glass with a friend, that's fine. A glass to keep out the cold, it's still seen as fine because, the wife's there and she's happy and everything's whatever. A glass too much, he's, drunk and stumbling around. Here we have drunk and riotous, which I guess would be drunk and disorderly nowadays. Up here, the summit attained, jolly companions, a confirmed drunkard, and then it's all downhill from here. Poverty and disease, you can tell because his hat's all messed up. Forsaken by friends, so now he doesn't even have drinking partners. He's drunk on his own. desperation and crime because he's used up all his money and he's having to steal money from people to get drunk. And then at the end, the dude just caps himself. And down here at the bottom, we have his wife and child. They're destitute because, well, he spent all his money on alcohol. So they're homeless and alone because he's gone. Yeah, it's all very dramatic and sad. And there's so much of this. Prohibition Party, it was just this idea that the Prohibition took off so dramatically that the Prohibition Party couldn't even really keep up with it. I thought that was kind of cool. And then there's a lot of these. Think of the children. I'm not thinking of that demon baby. Look at that face. I don't know, maybe babies just creep me out. Another, just think of the children. There's your typical Prohibition Party. The saloon or the boys and girls. Again, think of the children. Also, we were involved in World War I for like 6 months. So there was this thing about, like, if we get rid of alcohol, we'll have more grain to send to the front lines to make bread for the troops. But again, we were there for like 6 months. It wasn't long enough to be a big deal. But it was long enough to make propaganda. There's another one. I do like this one. Daddy's in there, and our shoes and stockings and clothes and food are in there too, and they'll never come out because Daddy's apparently drinking the high dollar stuff. Although I guess this could also be seen as like gambling. The American issue, saloonless nation and a stainless flag. Yes, America's never done anything wrong except for alcohol. Now that we don't have alcohol, our flag is stainless. We've done nothing wrong. Hopefully I'll remember to bring this up next chapter when we talk about the Philippines, because this is after the Philippines, after we nearly genocide an entire nation because we want to take their islands and they don't want us there. Yeah, U.S. has voted dry. 36 state ratifies dry amendment. Nebraska noses out Missouri for the honor of completing the job of writing Dry Act in the Constitution. Wyoming, Wisconsin, and Minnesota right on their heels. Those are a bunch of flat, boring states. Well, not Wyoming. Wisconsin is. Yep. Okay, let's talk about more social issue stuff, I guess. It was also pushed to end prostitution, but again, there were a number of reasons behind this. There was the issue of health. They kind of understood STDs. I mean, you know, there's simple cause and effect. They understand cause and effect. The concern of the virtue of the women involved. McClure's magazine ran a report on the prostitution in Chicago, calling it white slavery, though, of course, black and Asian women were subjected to prostitution as well. But, again, this is for American audiences, and American audiences are only worried about the white women that are being hurt by this, so that's the only concern for them. By 1915, all states had laws against sexual solicitation, beginning with the White Slave Trade Act, because again, America, which was put together by Representative James Mann. This was also known as the Mann Act, because of course, it's a law against prostitution to help women, presumably, and it's called the Mann Act. Now, this didn't just say, hey, let's not do prostitution because it's harmful to women. It also wanted to enforce traditional racial behavior due to one particular event. Now, not just this event, but events like this, and this event is like the main catalyst. In 1910, Jack Johnson, an African-American boxer, defeated the heavyweight champion Jim Jeffries, who happened to be white. And needless to say, the white Americans were not super cool about that. So they started trying to find ways to hurt this guy. And in 1913, he was prosecuted on moral charges due to his relations with white women, because you can't be doing that. You got different amounts of melanin in your skin, therefore crimes, I guess. I mean, these are Jim Crow laws all over again. It's like, oh, you can't be having relations with people that's got different amounts of melanin in your skin, so go to jail. There's also the issue of narcotics, which I'll get more into a little bit later. 250,000 Americans were addicted to opium, morphine, or cocaine. Eventually, the Harrison Narcotics Control Act of 1914 banned narcotics except for medicinal purposes. Now, I want to speak on this a little bit real quick. This wasn't like you had, people in the streets just shooting up all the time. Opium, morphine, and cocaine was just everywhere in the 1800s. It was, you just did all of it all the time. The way I described it to my students last time was, like, if you look at a movie from the 1940s and everybody's smoking cigarettes, you've got the big burly guys and they're smoking cigarettes, and you've got the little, dainty women and they're smoking cigarettes, and you've got, like, the children and they've got cigarettes. Like, it's the 1940s, everybody's smoking. If there were movies in the 1800s, they'd also be smoking, except they'd have opium. That was just the norm. I like to describe, and this is a little bit exaggerated, but not by much. I like to say that if you ever take a literature class, and you should, and you're wondering, what is up with this Edgar Allan Poe guy, the answer is usually opium. Because everybody was on opium. You got a cough? Have some opium. You're a little depressed? Have some opium. Your neck hurts? Have some opium. It was just everything. Head hurts? Morphine. It was just everything. It was like Tylenol for them. So then when they realized, oh, wait a minute, this stuff's really strong and everybody's addicted to it now, it was a little bit late. Like today with what's the big thing today? It's not narcotics specifically. I don't even remember now. It's not opiates, is it? No. But it was the same deal. It was just like doctors overprescribing things. Except back then, you didn't have to get a prescription for this stuff. Which I should be able to get to before the end of class. I'm going to show you guys some of the things that were being sold just around. Oh, do I not have where's the FDA? Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, municipal state reform. All right, we'll get there in just a minute. So here's the Great War on White Slavery, or fighting for the protection of our girls. Just ignoring the vast amounts of non-white women that were pushed into this, but, that's not going to sell it. Fighting the traffic in young girls, or the war on white slave trade. Here's a hell of a subtitle, which you guys might not be able to see due to the lights. The greatest crime in the world's history. Not the actual literal slavery that we had just a few decades before at this point. This one is actually surprisingly true to what was going on, where men would go down to the docks and pick up immigrant women coming in who, obviously didn't know anybody in the country at the time, and they're like, oh, we also speak your language, we can help you, and then like get them into prostitution rings, which this is at least like, I mean, it still says, what do we have here? Two of the most brutal of all the white slave traders who are in the traffic. So, like, it still pushes more for Italy, Swedes, Germany, etc. So it still is more the whites who are being attacked. But it's at least showing that it's more the immigrants that are being targeted, not like, oh no, us the poor American women, the poor white American women that are being accosted. It's like, no, it's usually the ones who are more vulnerable. Also, I love this one. Well, love/hate, because I hate the little human face he's got. It's so terrible. He's got a nose and a mouth. Why? Anyway, there's the Vice Octopus in Chicago. Ugh. Here is, I'm terrible with names, Jack Johnson. And apparently we've got an ad here in the background, James E. Pepper Whiskey. All right. One more thing that this social control was pushing for was immigration restriction. So despite the actions of the settlement houses, of like, you know, it's not the immigrants' fault that they're being pushed into, you know, crime and squalor. They're doing their best, and we just need to like help them with education and you know, opportunities. Some of this some of this moral reform was saying, oh no, actually these immigrants are immoral, and they're quote inferior to whites. But a lot of it was, again, religious bigotry. Catholics and Jews were seen as dangerous to Christianity, despite, again, it all being basically the same Abrahamic thing. I mean, it takes all of like 5 minutes of religious research. Just like Christianity came from, I mean, Catholicism came from Judaism, and then Protestantism came from Catholicism. So like, what? Of course, though, when it came to restricting immigration, it came to the Asians. We have, of course, had the Chinese Exclusion Act, kept out all Chinese immigrants, and those that were here were not allowed to become citizens, so they just got the worst of it. In 1908, Theodore Roosevelt entered into a restricted immigration agreement with Japan because, well, the Japanese government's always been, I don't have a better way to say it. They've always been kind of xenophobic. They're not super cool with any kind of immigration going in, but they're also not really happy with their citizens going out. They don't have a very high birth rate, so they don't like their people leaving either. And there's also this like cultural stigma of, if you like leave Japan for a couple of years and then come back, you're not like really Japanese anymore. They've got a very strict culture. So this restriction of Japanese immigrants wasn't like the Chinese restriction of just like, we can't have any more Chinese because racism. The Japanese immigration restriction, while it was largely still racism, it was agreed with the Japanese government because they didn't want their people leaving. Now, Californians were not happy with just restriction and barred all Japanese immigrants from buying land, with 12 other states soon doing the same. And if you can't buy land, you can't really like build a home and have a farm, so that made it very difficult to settle in the West. And then we had all sorts of fun immigration restrictions just across the board. Congress passed legislation that banned illiterates who cannot read English or their native tongue, which again, literacy like worldwide up until the 1950s was really low. Like even here in America, honestly, it wasn't until the 70s or 80s that literacy rates really shot through the roof, and that was mostly in the USSR. The highest literacy rates in the world were in the USSR. It was like 90%. So, by the way. Banned other undesirables like alcoholics, feeble-minded persons, whatever that means, epileptics, okay, people mentally or physically defective, which again, like, boy, that sounds like something that's going to come up later, professional beggars, whatever that is, anarchists, that one I can kind of get, but also, would you write anarchist, like, on your passport? What's your profession? I'm an anarchist. Oh, okay. And polygamist, which, I mean, okay, that can be dangerous for people there, but like, I don't know. I don't know how many polygamists are out there. So yeah, the whole like America open to immigrants, we're a land of immigration. This kind of getting shut down here in the early 1900s. Which, granted, in 1917, it's World War I's happening, and there's a lot of people trying to get out of Europe, so that's probably what a lot of this was in response to. And then we restrict a lot of immigration in World War II, which causes issues, but we'll get to that later. There's this image that I've wanted to do since we talked about Chinese exclusion. So there was apparently Russia excluding Jewish Americans. Where is my mouse? And American diplomats were protesting this because it's like, hey, Russia, you can't just like kick out Jewish Americans. That's not fair. But we've kind of been doing that for decades at this point. And of course, there were different views on that. Encouragement to Chinese immigration. And while this one is negative because, you know, this one's saying this is how it ought to be, what we would like to see. China, and this is, I'm pretty sure this is either Russians or maybe even Germans. Yeah. The WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. This one I ended up grabbing. It's not really relevant. This is the Russo-Japanese War. Russia and Japan with Korea in the middle. Korea was trying to stay neutral and just ended up getting carved up. Oh, and speaking of immigrants, while this doesn't actually discuss it, there was also the Irish. The Irish were looked down upon pretty badly at this time as well. You see here this Irishman looking barely human. I mean, they were often depicted as apes. This one I wouldn't even call an ape. It's just barely humanoid with a bottle of rum, sitting on a gunpowder barrel with a lit torch, which, knowing about as many Irish rebellions as I know about, this isn't that far off. At least the sitting on the barrel with a lit torch. The American East Wall, as Congressman Burnett would build it. You're welcome in if you can climb it. Yeah, land of the free, except to be barbed wire at the top. Sorry, razor wire. There's European immigration restriction. All right, let's get a little bit more, Because in fact, I think that might be a good place. Okay. So cities were growing, and their need for a new type of government grew as well. And as we saw with the political machines and the city bosses, all this graft and corruption was not gonna work. So the commission form of government grew out of this. Now, interestingly enough, the commission form of government didn't happen due to some need of reform because of the political machines and their corruption being slow and all that. It happened because Galveston, Texas was destroyed by a hurricane. And the systems of government that were in place there, the mayor and the city council, were not able to respond swiftly enough to get aid to the people of Galveston. So they were replaced by an elected commission, each that ran a municipal department like a business. And by 1917, this form of government had taken hold in more than 400 cities. So this idea, I mean, like I've said with ideas, it doesn't even have to, you didn't have to have every city that took this form of government destroyed by a hurricane. But that was the starting point, and it was so efficient that other cities were like, hey, this is a good idea. Now, to get rid of the political machines, reformers would use direct elections so that the politicians wouldn't select the civil leaders just on their own. So rather than just like letting them choose their people, they would demand elections. They also use at-large elections, which rather than using districts, which as we have seen multiple times throughout history, and yet today we still use districts, ran votes across the entire city so that they couldn't use districts that would give certain groups extra power. Because you can, I've seen it worked out like on a board before, where you can have like equal numbers of people, but if you cut districts in a certain way, one group can come out more powerful. It's weird. I mean, it's called, and you can also call it gerrymandering, where you cut districts a certain way that dilutes the power of one group, which gives the other group more power. So then you have the city and state governments helping the working class, women and children. And by 1913, 3/4 of the states had ratified the 17th Amendment that made senators elected by popular vote. Because again, that wasn't a thing until this point. Senators were elected by the state representatives. You elected your state representatives, but your senators were elected by other elected officials. You didn't get to choose your senators. But it finally got pushed to the point that popular votes for elected senators became a thing, which was good. And also, that was something that that the populace pushed, if you recall. Also, here's Galveston after the hurricane. Like, there was not a lot left. I've always found natural disasters fascinating, especially like at the turn of the century when our buildings weren't that strong. And we're like, oh, we've got permanent cities, and then the world reminds us that, oh, maybe not. So they built a big old seawall. I'm pretty sure they've got an even bigger one there now. Yeah, living on the Gulf Coast is asking for trouble. Just ask Florida. Electing the Senate, indirect democracy before the 17th Amendment. Yeah, indirect democracy is kind of weird, which is still sort of what we have to a degree. Where is... Oops, sorry about that. Oh, it's in the Teddy Roosevelt thing. Okay. Well, we'll do that next time, then. All right, let me at least do conservation, and then we will finish. Actually, yeah, we'll end early today because I need to have enough next time to justify not doing the study guide next time. So yeah, we'll just end here. Yeah, I'll see you guys on Monday, and then on Wednesday we'll do the study guide.